You ever just stop and think about, I don't know, the crazy diversity of life on this planet?
All the time.
Like vertebrates alone. We got the blue whale, absolutely massive, right?
Yeah.
Bigger than a jumbo jet. And then you've got this tiny fish, what is it, the Schindleria brevipinguis?
That's the one.
Barely bigger than a fingernail. That size difference.
Yeah.
I mean, it's almost too much to wrap your head around.
Yeah, it makes you wonder how on Earth such different forms could possibly come from a common ancestor, doesn't it?
Exactly. And that's what we're diving into today, this incredible story of vertebrates.
It really is a remarkable journey when you think about it. From those earliest chordates, basically simple creatures with a notochord for support.
Right, like a proto-backbone.
Exactly. And from that, the whole lineage branches out, evolves all the way to us, Homo sapiens, with our complex skeletons and everything.
And the cool thing is, we've got a ton of information here that lays out the whole thing. The key characteristics of vertebrates, all those major groups living and extinct, their evolution, the big leaps, and of course, where we humans fit into the whole picture.
It's a pretty comprehensive story, and what we're going to do is unpack it for you, distill it down to the essentials so you can grasp those crucial evolutionary steps, the key concepts.
That's the goal. We want to give you that aha moment.
Yeah,
The one where you suddenly see those connections, the bigger picture.
exactly.
So let's rewind, way back, before they were even vertebrates as we know them. It all starts with a group called chordates. But even chordates themselves aren't the beginning. They belong to an even larger group, Deuterostomia.
A real mouthful, right?
Yeah, but here's the thing. Deuterostomia also includes some pretty surprising relatives, invertebrates actually. Things like starfish and sea urchins.
Maybe echinoderms.
Right. Who knew we shared such deep ancestry with those spiny sea creatures?
It's a reminder that evolution takes some pretty unexpected twists and turns. But there you have it, common ancestry. It's written in our genes, in our development.
So what sets chordates apart? What makes them, well, chordates?
Okay, so there are 4 key characteristics that define a chordate. Now, keep in mind, these features might only be present during embryonic development in some species.
Okay, so not always visible in adults. Got it.
Right. But these 4 traits are the foundation of the whole group. First up, we have the notochord.
The notochord. I remember this from biology class. It's like a flexible rod, right?
You got it. It runs along the back, between the digestive tube and the nerve cord. Think of it as a primitive backbone, a sort of skeletal support system.
And it's made of, what, fluid-filled cells?
Yeah, encased in some tough fibrous tissue. And this notochord, it's not just there for structure, it's also crucial for muscle attachment, especially for those early chordates that were swimming.
So this is what allowed them to move through the water.
Exactly. Now here's the interesting part. In most vertebrates, that notochord gets replaced by a more developed backbone made of, well, vertebrae. But even we humans...
We still have a notochord.
Not exactly. It's more like remnants of it, those gelatinous discs between our vertebrae.
Wait, seriously?
Yeah, those are actually leftover bits of our embryonic notochord. It's kind of wild when you think about it.
So even in our super complex skeletons, there's this echo of our evolutionary past.
Precisely. Okay, moving on to the second defining characteristic of chordates, the dorsal hollow nerve cord.
Dorsal meaning on back.
Yep, on the back, above the notochord. And here's what's unique about it. It's hollow. This is different from most other animals, which have solid nerve cords, often located ventrally.
Ventrally being on the belly side.
Right. So in chordates, this hollow nerve cord develops from a layer of ectoderm, the outer cell layer, that folds into a tube. And this, my friend, is what eventually becomes our central nervous system.
The brain and spinal cord.
The command center, the whole shebang. And this structure, this hollow tube, it's a defining chordate feature.
Okay, on to number 3. Pharyngeal slits, or clefts. Now, those sound a little more complicated.
They are fascinating, for sure. These are openings in the pharynx, the area right behind the mouth. You can think of them like old slits or pouches. And their original function, at least in many invertebrate chordates, was for filter feeding. They'd draw water in, and these slits, lined with a mucus net, would trap tiny food particles.
Like a built-in sieve.
Exactly. But as vertebrates evolved, those slits went through some pretty dramatic changes. In aquatic vertebrates, like fish, they developed into gills.
Makes sense. The gills are crucial for breathing underwater.
Absolutely. And then when we get to tetrapods...
The 4-limbed vertebrates, the land dwellers.
Right. In tetrapods, those pharyngeal clefts don't even develop into full-blown slits. The tissue around them gets repurposed.
Repurposed, meaning they form something else.
Exactly. They contribute to parts of the ears and other structures in the head and neck. It's like evolution took this existing structure and said, hey, we can use this for something completely different.
It's almost like evolutionary recycling. Okay, last but not least, we have the muscular postanal tail.
Ah, yes, the tail. This one's pretty straightforward. It's a tail that extends beyond the anus. And while you might not think of yourself as having one,
Well, I'm not exactly swinging from trees with my tail, am I?
no, but all chordate embryos have one. And lots of adult chordates keep theirs. It's got skeletal elements, muscles, and it's super important for propulsion in water.
So fish use it for swimming.
Exactly. In us humans, that tail shrinks way down during development, which is why we don't have a big, obvious one as adults.
Okay, so those are our 4 chordate VIPs. Notochord, dorsal hollow nerve cord, pharyngeal slits, and the postanal tail. Now, the chapter dives into 2 specific groups of invertebrate chordates, lancelets and tunicates. Lancelets first. They're also called cephalochordates, which, if I'm not mistaken, refers to their shape, right?
You're spot on. Cephalochordate means head chordate. They've got this slender, blade-like shape, and they're considered the closest living relatives to all other chordates.
So they're like a glimpse into our distant past.
You could say that. Now, what's really cool about lancelets is that they keep all 4 of those core chordate features throughout their entire adult lives. They've got the notochord running the length of their body, the dorsal hollow nerve cord, pharyngeal slits, the whole works.
And how do they make a living? I mean, what do they eat?
They're filter feeders. They draw water into their mouth, and they have this mucus net that stretches across those pharyngeal slits, trapping food particles.
So they're like underwater vacuum cleaners, basically.
In a way, yeah. They're not exactly speed demons, but they move by coordinating muscle contractions along their notochord. And this segmented body plan.
Segmented, meaning they're made up of repeating units.
Exactly. That's something we also see in early vertebrate embryos, another connection. And while lancelets aren't exactly common globally, they can be incredibly abundant in certain areas. Imagine a whole seafloor teeming with these little guys.
It's amazing to think about. Okay, on to tunicates, Eurochordates, right. And here's where things get a little weird. They're actually more closely related to us, the vertebrates, than lancelets are. At least that's what molecular studies are suggesting.
Yeah, it's kind of counterintuitive when you look at them. Adult tunicates, they don't exactly scream chordate.
They look nothing like lancelets.
Not at all. But the key to understanding this relationship lies in their larval stage. The
Yeah.
tunicate larva. Well, it has all 4 chordate characteristics. It looks a bit like a tiny tadpole swimming around using its tail and notochord.
Okay, so a bit more chordate in their youth.
Precisely. But here's the thing. That larval stage doesn't last long. Once a tunicate finds a suitable spot, it undergoes a radical transformation. It loses its tail, its notochord, its nervous system gets simplified, and its whole body plan basically rotates almost 90 degrees.
Wait, what? A 90-degree rotation?
Yeah, it's a pretty dramatic makeover. And the adult tunicate ends up looking, well, kind of like a blob, honestly.
So what's the deal with the adult form? How do they survive looking like that?
They're sessile filter feeders. They've got these 2 siphons, an incurrent one to draw water in and an excurrent one to expel it. The water passes through their pharyngeal slits, which are still there, and food particles get trapped in a mucus net. And they've even got this funny defense mechanism if you disturb them.
Beta attack.
Not quite. They forcefully squirt water out, hence the nickname sea squirts. Pretty clever, huh? But yeah, it's wild to think that these seemingly simple creatures are more closely related to us than the lancelets, which at least resemble the classic chordate body plan.
So another reminder that evolution isn't always a straightforward path.
Absolutely. And here's another interesting twist. Tunicates actually lose 4 of their Hox genes during development.
Right.
Now, Hox genes, these are like the master regulators of body plan development in animals.
Okay, so pretty important genes.
Crucial. And the fact that tunicates have fewer of them than other chordates, well, it suggests that their simplified adult form isn't primitive. It's actually a result of genetic modification.
So they've streamlined their genetics to match their lifestyle.
Exactly. It's a reminder that evolution isn't always about adding complexity. Sometimes it's about losing it.
Fascinating stuff. So taking all this into account, what can we deduce about those very first chordates? What did they look like?
Well, the evidence points towards a lancelet-like ancestor, that basic chordate blueprint, the notochord, nerve cord, pharyngeal slits, a postanal tail for swimming. That seems to be the foundation.
And then from that foundation, the entire vertebrate lineage arose.
Precisely. And you know what's really cool? Both lancelets and tunicates, their genetic makeup, it gives us some incredible clues about the genes those early chordates had and how they might have evolved into the more complex vertebrate genome.
So we're talking about like the genes that make a heart, a thyroid gland, things like that.
Exactly. Those genes are found in both tunicates and vertebrates, but not in other invertebrates. It suggests they were present in the common ancestor. And get this, there's even some evidence hinting that tunicates have embryonic cells similar to the neural crest. Now, the neural crest, this is a big deal in vertebrates.
We talked about those neural crest cells earlier.
Yeah.
They migrate throughout the embryo and form all sorts of different tissues.
Exactly. So finding something similar in tunicates, it suggests the groundwork for the neural crest might have been laid down even before vertebrates branched off. It's like we're getting a glimpse of evolution in progress.
Okay, so we have a picture of these early chordates. Now let's fast forward a bit. How did vertebrates, those creatures with a true backbone, emerge from this ancestral line?
Well, that takes us to the Cambrian period, around 540 million years ago. That's when a specific lineage of chordates started down the path towards becoming vertebrates.
And what was the big change? What set them apart?
It was all about complexity. They developed a more sophisticated nervous system and a more elaborate skeleton. This gave them a serious edge, better at catching food, avoiding predators, all of that.
So survival of the fittest? The ones with the better tools were more likely to thrive?
Exactly. Now, there are a few key features that really distinguish vertebrates. Firstly, their Hox genes. Remember how we talked about tunicates losing some of theirs? Well, vertebrates went in the opposite direction. They duplicated theirs. And not just Hox genes, other important gene families too.
So instead of streamlining, they were adding more complexity.
Exactly. It's like having a spare set of blueprints, allowing for experimentation, the development of new features without messing up the existing ones. This genetic flexibility was likely key to the vertebrate explosion, the incredible diversification of this group. And it's probably also why vertebrates were able to evolve a more intricate nervous system and a more sophisticated skeleton.
Right, because that extra genetic material gave them more to work with, more room to evolve.
Precisely. And speaking of skeletons, that's another key difference. Vertebrates have a skull and a backbone made of vertebrae. Now, in the very earliest vertebrates, those vertebrae might have been just cartilaginous extensions, but in most, they became much more substantial, encasing the spinal cord, providing protection, and taking over as the main support structure.
Okay, so from simple notochord to a full-fledged backbone.
Exactly. And then there's the neural crest. We touched on this earlier, but it's worth emphasizing. It's this unique group of cells that arise during embryonic development.
They're the ones that migrate all over and form different tissues.
You got it. Teeth, parts of the skull, neurons, sensory capsules, you name it, the neural crest is probably involved. It's like this versatile toolkit for building a vertebrate body.
Amazing. Okay, so those are some of the big defining features of vertebrates. Now, let's meet some of the early players in this evolutionary saga. We're introduced to hagfishes and lampreys.
These are the only living vertebrates that lack jaws. They're grouped together as cyclostomes, which basically means circular mouth.
So they're like the OG vertebrates, the ones that came before jaws evolved?
You could say that. Hagfishes first. They're also called myxini. They have a cartilaginous skull. And their vertebrae are pretty reduced. They've got this long snake-like body, and they swim by flexing those segmented muscles against their notochord, which they keep throughout their lives.
So they're still relying on that ancestral notochord for support.
Exactly. And they've got these tooth-like structures made of keratin, the same stuff that makes our fingernails.
Interesting. So what's life like for a hagfish?
Well, all the living species, about 30 of them, are marine. And most of them are scavengers. They live on the ocean floor, munching on things like worms and dead fish.
Not exactly glamorous.
No, but they've got this pretty incredible defense mechanism. When they're threatened, they produce a massive amount of slime.
Slime. Ew.
Yeah, it's super sticky. And they can produce a ton of it in, less than a minute. It can actually clog the gills of a predator. So they either retreat or, suffocate.
It's a unique defense strategy.
To say the least. But this slime isn't just gross. Scientists are actually studying it for potential medical uses. Imagine a gel that could stop bleeding during surgery.
So there might be some hidden benefits to hagfish slime.
Who would have thought? Okay, now, on to lampreys. They're the Petra myzontida. Unlike hagfishes, they do have some rudimentary vertebrae made of cartilage, but their notochord is still the main skeletal support.
So a bit of an upgrade in the backbone department.
You could say that. There are about 38 species of lampreys, both marine and freshwater. Some of them are parasitic. They use their round, jawless mouth to attach to a fish and then use their rasping tongue to, well, basically drill a hole and suck its blood.
Ugh, that's pretty gruesome.
Yeah, not exactly a pleasant way to make a living. But their larvae are actually filter feeders. They live buried in sediment looking a lot like lancelets.
So another example of that biphasic life cycle.
Exactly. And some lampreys stay non-parasitic their whole lives. They feed as larvae, then reach sexual maturity, reproduce, and die within days.
A short and intense adult life.
You could say that. Unfortunately, one particular lamprey, the sea lamprey, has become a real problem in the Great Lakes. It's invasive and has wreaked havoc on the native fish populations.
So even these ancient jawless vertebrates can have a big impact on modern ecosystems.
That's for sure. Now, beyond the living cyclostomes, we also get some amazing insights from fossils. The chapter highlights some incredible finds from the Cambrian period, about 530 million years ago, from China.
So fossils that predate even hagfishes and lampreys?
Exactly. One of them is called Haikuella. It had a lot in common with lancelets, especially its mouth, suggesting it was a filter feeder. But it also has some vertebrate features: a brain, small eyes, and segmented muscles.
It's a bit of a mix and match.
Yeah, a real mosaic, but it didn't have a skull or ear organs. Those came later.
Okay, and then there's Mylocommingia.
Now, Mylocommingia, this one's really exciting. It's considered the earliest chordate with a distinct head.
So a major evolutionary milestone.
Absolutely. It had structures resembling ear capsules and eye capsules, basically the parts of the skull that protect those organs. But like Haikuella, it didn't have vertebrae, so not quite a vertebrate yet.
So close, but not quite there yet.
Right. And after these guys, we see the Gnathostomes emerge. Another group of jawless vertebrates, but they were around for a long time, from about 500 to 200 million years ago. Unlike hagfishes and lampreys, Gnathostomes had mineralized mouth parts. They were like these intricate arrays of hooks and slicing elements.
Well, what were those used for?
Probably predation or scavenging, and these fossilized dental elements are incredibly abundant. Geologists use them to date rock layers. They're like tiny time capsules.
That's so cool. So Gnathostomes, these tiny jawless vertebrates, are helping us understand the history of our planet.
Exactly. The chapter also mentions other groups of jawless vertebrates that appeared later. Many of them had paired fins and an inner ear with two semicircular canals like lampreys, but they were also often covered in bony armor for protection.
So a bit more heavily armored than hagfishes and lampreys.
Definitely. But despite their success for a time, all these jawless armored vertebrates eventually went extinct.
Extinct? Why do you think that happened?
Well, there are a few ideas, but it likely had to do with competition from other more successful groups. Speaking of which, this brings us to a really important point. You know how our skeletons are mostly bone?
Yeah.
Well, in the earliest vertebrates, the skeleton was primarily cartilage.
Really? So bone came later?
Exactly. Mineralization, the process of hardening those skeletal tissues, it happened gradually. It started with the outer surface of the skull in some jawless vertebrates, and then eventually a thin layer of bone lining the internal cartilage.
So the bony skeleton that we think of as typical for vertebrates, that wasn't there from the beginning.
Exactly. And it was the emergence of jawed vertebrates that really saw a significant increase in bone development.
Which leads us perfectly to the next chapter in the story. The rise of the Gnathostomes, the jawed vertebrates.
This is a huge turning point. While those jawless vertebrates were around in the early Paleozoic, they've been completely outnumbered by the jawed vertebrates. This incredibly diverse group includes everything from sharks and rays to all the different bony fishes and, of course, the tetrapods.
So that's us.
Exactly. And the evolution of jaws, that was a game changer. Gnathostome literally means jaw mouth, and those hinged structures, often equipped with teeth, they revolutionized the way vertebrates interacted with their environment.
Jaws allowed them to grab and hold prey, right?
Exactly. And the prevailing theory is that jaws actually evolved from the skeletal rods that supported the anterior pharyngeal slits, the ones that were originally part of the filter feeding apparatus.
They were repurposed for a completely different function.
Exactly. And once jaws took over the task of grabbing food, the other gill slits could specialize for respiration.
Makes sense. So what other innovations did these jawed vertebrates come up with?
Well, remember how vertebrates duplicated those Hox genes? Gnathostomes did it again. They went from one set in early chordates to 4 sets.
Wow, that's a lot of extra genetic material.
And it probably played a big role in the development of jaws and all the other complex features we see in gnathostomes. They also have an enlarged forebrain compared to other vertebrates, which is linked to a better sense of smell and vision.
So they were getting smarter too.
You could say that. And in the aquatic gnathostomes, we see the evolution of the lateral line system.
The lateral line system. Remind me what that is again.
It's a series of sensory organs along the sides of the body. They're incredibly sensitive to vibrations and pressure changes in the water.
So it's like a sixth sense for sensing their surroundings.
Exactly. Crucial for detecting both prey and predators. And then, paired fins and a tail, those became super important for efficient swimming. Some even developed fins with bony rays for even better thrust and control.
So they were becoming incredibly well adapted for life in water.
Absolutely. Now let's talk about some of those early jawed vertebrates. The fossil record introduces us to the placoderms, these extinct armored fish. They had bony plates covering their heads and often much of their bodies.
Armored fish.
Huh.
So like underwater knights.
Kind of. And while most placoderms were fairly small, some were huge. Osteichthyes, for example, could grow over 10 meters long.
Wow, that's a big fish.
Yeah, a real apex predator. There were also the acanthodians, another group of early jawed vertebrates, sometimes called spiny sharks, although they weren't really sharks.
What happened to these early groups?
They went extinct.
Extinct. Why?
Well, that's always a complex question. Competition from other groups, environmental changes, a combination of factors. But it's important to remember that extinction is a natural part of evolution.
Right. It makes space for new lineages to evolve.
Exactly. Now, those early jawed vertebrates might be gone, but by around 420 million years ago, the gnathostomes had already branched into the three lineages that have persisted to this day.
The lineages that led to all the jawed vertebrates alive today.
Exactly. There are the chondrichthyans, the ray-finned fishes, and the lobe-finned fishes. Let's start with the chondrichthyans.
Chondrichthyans, that rings a bell.
Think sharks, rays, and chimeras. They're often called the cartilage fishes because their skeletons are mostly made of cartilage. Now, when they were first discovered, people thought that their cartilaginous skeleton was a primitive trait, like they never evolved bone.
So they were seen as a kind of missing link.
Right, but we know now that's not the case. The fossil record shows that bone was already present in earlier vertebrates. And there's evidence that even early chondrichthyans had bony tissues.
So they're mostly cartilaginous skeletons are actually a secondary adaptation.
Exactly. They probably evolved from ancestors with bony skeletons. It's a reminder that evolution doesn't always move in a straight line from simple to complex. Sometimes it goes the other way around.
That's pretty mind-blowing. So tell me more about these chondrichthyans.
Okay, so sharks first. There are about 1,000 living species. They're mostly streamlined, built for speed. They've got powerful tails for propulsion, dorsal fins for stability, and paired fins for maneuvering. And many of them have large livers filled with oil to help with buoyancy.
So they don't sink like a stone.
Right, but they're still denser than water, so many have to keep swimming to avoid sinking. And also to keep water flowing over their gills so they can breathe.
Makes sense. And I know sharks have a reputation for being, well, fierce predators.
Most are carnivorous, yeah. They have those sharp, often serrated teeth, and they lose and replace them throughout their lives. Their digestive tract is pretty short, but many have a spiral valve in their intestine to increase surface area for nutrient absorption.
So they're efficient eaters.
Definitely. And their senses are incredibly sharp. They have excellent vision, although they probably don't see color very well. They have an amazing sense of smell. And get this, they can detect weak electric fields generated by muscle contractions in other animals.
Wait, seriously?
Yeah, it's called electroreception. And like other fish, they don't have external eardrums. Sound waves travel through the water to their inner ear.
So they're basically swimming sensory powerhouses.
Pretty much. And when it comes to reproduction, sharks have a variety of strategies. Some lay eggs, some give birth to live young. Fertilization is always internal, and males have these claspers, modified parts of their pelvic fins, to transfer sperm to the female.
Interesting. And what about rays? Are they similar to sharks?
Well, they're closely related, but they've adopted a very different lifestyle. Most rays are bottom dwellers. They've got those flattened bodies, and they use their enlarged pectoral fins to glide along the seabed.
Like underwater birds.
In a way, yeah. They feed mostly on mollusks and crustaceans, crushing them with their powerful jaws. And many rays have that whip-like tail. Some even have venomous barbs for defense.
Yikes.
Yeah, you don't want to mess with those. Sadly, though, both sharks and rays are facing threats from overfishing. Some populations have declined dramatically.
That's worrying. Okay, on to the next lineage. The Osteichthyes. That's a mouthful.
It is, but it's an incredibly important group. We're talking about bony fishes and tetrapods.
Wait, we're in that group?
We are. Tetrapods, despite being land dwellers, are a branch of the Osteichthyes family tree.
So we're basically highly evolved fish.
In a way, yeah. Now, most Osteichthyes have a bony endoskeleton hardened with calcium phosphate, and they have a lot of other features that set them apart.
Like what?
Well, most of the aquatic Osteichthyes, the ones we typically call fish, they breathe by drawing water over their gills, which are protected by a bony flap called the operculum. And they have a swim bladder, an air-filled sac that helps them control their buoyancy.
The swim bladder, I remember that.
Yeah, it actually evolved from lungs. The earliest Osteichthyes had lungs and used them to breathe air. In some lineages, those lungs evolved into the swim bladder.
So it's like an air sac repurposed for buoyancy.
Exactly. Osteichthyes also have a lateral line system, similar to sharks and rays, for detecting vibrations and pressure changes in the water. And their reproductive strategies are super diverse.
Okay, so there's a lot of variation within the Osteichthyes?
A ton. And within this group, we have two major lineages: the ray-finned fishes and the lobe-finned fishes. Ray-finned fishes first. They're called Actinopterygii, and they're the most diverse group of vertebrates, over 27,000 species.
That's a lot of fish.
It is. They're called ray-finned because their fins are supported by these bony rays. They first appeared in the Silurian period, and they've adapted to pretty much every aquatic environment you can think of.
And we rely on them for food, right?
Big time. Unfortunately, overfishing and habitat destruction are major threats to many ray-finned fish species.
Another conservation concern. Okay, what about the lobe-finned fishes?
Ah, the Sarcopterygii. They also appeared in the Silurian, and their big defining feature is the presence of rod-shaped bones in their pectoral and pelvic fins, surrounded by muscle. These lobe fins might have been used for moving around in shallow water, maybe even on land.
So they were kind of like the precursors to limbs.
You could say that. Now, there are only 3 lineages of lobe-finned fishes alive today. First, there are the coelacanths. They were thought to be extinct until one was discovered in 1938.
Why, seriously?
Yeah, it was a huge deal. Since then, more have been found, possibly a second species, living fossils.
Wow, that's incredible. What about the other 2 lineages?
The second is the lungfishes, or dipnoi. There are 6 species, and they all live in fresh water. As their name suggests, they have lungs and can gulp air at the surface. They also have gills, though.
So they can breathe both in and out of water.
Exactly. And some can even burrow into the mud and go dormant when their ponds or rivers dry up. It's called estivation.
That's a neat trick. What about the 3rd lineage?
That's the one that leads to us, the lineage that adapted to life on land and gave rise to the tetrapods.
The tetrapods. So we're talking amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. The whole gang.
Exactly. And this transition to land, it's one of the most significant events in vertebrate evolution.
So let's talk about the origin of tetrapods. This is where those lobed fins evolved into limbs with digits, right?
That's right. It happened around 365 million years ago, and this adaptation opened up a whole new world for vertebrates.
The world of land.
Exactly. And tetrapods, they have a bunch of adaptations for life on land. The most obvious one is limbs with digits, replacing fins. These limbs support the body's weight against gravity and allow for efficient locomotion.
So no more swimming, they were walking.
Well, maybe not walking as we do, but certainly moving around on land. Tetrapods also evolved a neck, which allowed for head movement, and their pelvic girdle fused to their backbone for better force transfer. And as adults, most lost their gills, those pharyngeal clefts we talked about. They were repurposed to form parts of the ears and other structures.
Another example of evolution taking an existing structure and giving it a new job.
Precisely. And speaking of transitions, we have this amazing fossil called Tiktaalik. It's been nicknamed the fishapod because it has features of both fish and tetrapods.
So kind of a missing link.
You could say that. It had fins, gills, lungs, and scales, but it also had ribs, a neck, and even the basic bone pattern of limbs in its front fins. Its pelvis and rear fin were more robust too. It likely wasn't walking on land like we do, but it shows how.